Good morning.
Good morning.
So I do a lot of guest preaching all around the cities and around the state. It's good to see that the Methodists are keeping in tradition that the first few rows are reserved for the ghosts of the church. It's good to see. I get it. When the preacher gets boring, you want to make a quick exit and not be noticed. Trust me, we noticed you. Ahu Kulomasi, ni Dijinji Makwa, Jimber Jacobs. Ni Guka, Howard Jacobs, Nina Comis, Greta Jacobs. Ni Tak Dalangamau, ni Mahikanu, and Nakako Satawa, Anishik, 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 Anishik. I give you greetings this morning. Introduce myself as Bear, or Jim Bear Jacobs. You can just call me Jim Bear. I introduce myself as the grandson of Howard Jacobs and Greta Jacobs. I'm a member of the Turtle Clan of the Mohican Nation, and with deepest gratitude in my heart, I extend my thanks for your invitation today. I've been invited to preach this morning's message. It's a role I'm not all that comfortable with, if I'm honest. I don't consider myself a good preacher. I know that's a disappointment for those of you sitting in the back. And what I mean by that is not that I can't preach or I don't know how to preach. I went to school, I got the degrees, I took the classes with all the Greek names and can do a sermon with 3 points in a straight line, moving to a final point. That's not my style, though. At best, I'm an average preacher. Where I'm gifted is as a storyteller. And storytellers don't move in that straight line through 3 points and then on to a conclusion. Storytellers, if you're not familiar, are wildly erratic, circular, don't color within the lines, and eventually finish. That's where I'm gifted, is this kind of erratic, coloring outside the lines kind of speaker. And if you will extend to me some grace, I'd like to tell you some stories. I promise we'll arrive at a final point. Probably is not going to take the trajectory that you think, but if you're okay with me not having a 3-point outline sermon, I'd like to bring you along this morning. Does that sound good? Okay. Some of you are old enough to remember the late 70s. In the late 70s, along came a TV commercial which ignited an entire generation towards environmental justice. The commercial opened with a camera overlooking these beautiful, pristine waters. And some native, we'll put that in quotes, native drumming can be heard in the background. And then a canoe appears as this incredibly regal-looking Native American man paddles his canoe across these pristine waters. And as he's moving towards his destination, the waters become a little bit less pristine. And there's refuse floating in the water and all sorts of garbage in the water. And finally, this incredibly regal-looking Native American man lands his canoe on the banks of the water. and he ascends a small hill. And now he's standing at the side of a highway. And a car drives by and throws trash out their window, and it lands at the feet of our Native American man. At this point, this is the greatest moment in cinematography history. The Native man turns to the camera. The camera zooms in tight on his face, and a single tear rolls down his cheek. We refer to that as the crying Indian. How many of you remember the crying Indian? Yeah. This TV commercial, as I said, ignited an entire generation towards environmental justice. And it's a beautiful commercial. There's just a couple of things wrong with it. Number one, if you're going to have a character that's a Native American man, you might want to consider getting a Native American man to play that character. How many of you knew that that guy isn't Native? He's Italian. Yeah. He should win an award for best performance by an Italian in a cross-cultural role. But whatever, this is what we had to deal with back in the 70s. First problem, he's not Native. This commercial gave us essentially our rallying cry for environmental justice for an entire generation. The call of this commercial essentially boiled down to this: the earth is our most precious resource, and it's incumbent upon us to protect it. How many of you, to you, that sounds somewhat familiar? Right? It's an ideology that we would like to believe we embody. The earth is our most precious resource, and it's incumbent upon us to protect it. That is a good ideology, but I think it falls short. I think we can do better. I'm going to tell you how we can do better in a little bit. Here's tangent number one. I told you, we're going in circles today, folks. There is a criticism, a valid criticism of the monotheistic faiths. The primary monotheistic faiths being Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And the criticism is that, if you really boil it down, it's very patriarchal. Great news if you're a guy. If you're a woman, sorry about that. Not much we can do, right? The book says what it says. And a valid question can be asked in the monotheistic faith. A valid question of Christianity is, where is God's female counterpart? We have, through the ancient stories, we have God as our father. Where is our mother? It's a valid question. Throughout history, people have attempted to fill that gap, to fill that role of divine feminine. Israel utilized deities like Asherah, or references to the Queen of Heaven, or even in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom. Some would even argue that in the era of Christianity, the motivation for the Catholic Church to venerate the Virgin Mary is an attempt to fill the void left by the divine feminine. Where is the divine feminine? Where is she? He'll tell you where she is, but not yet. 4 years ago, my family, we purchased our first house. We were now homeowners. And when you're a first-time home buyer, you make mistakes. Things that you say to yourself, I'm never going to do it that way again. One of the things that they tell you not to do is don't buy a house in the winter. Well, we bought our house in the winter. And it's funny that the realtors will tell you never buy a house in the winter as they're selling you a house in the winter. When we bought our first house, we were excited. My wife and I, our 4 kids, moved into our house. And as the winter gave way to spring and the snow was melting, it revealed a yard that was in serious need. See, the previous owners had lived there for about 28, 29 years, and by all appearances, for about the last 5 or 6 years, they just kind of neglected the yard. And it had all of these trees that were very young trees growing in very inconvenient places along the yard. You know, they were growing along the fence line, so if left unchecked, they would wreck our fence. They were growing kind of too close to the foundation of our garage. And they weren't large trees. There wasn't any big concern about that. The largest tree was a cedar tree. It's about as big around as a dinner plate, maybe 12 feet tall. But it was half dead on one side, and it was leaning towards some power lines. And I actually, upon seeing all this, I got excited because 3 or 4 years prior to this, I bought a chainsaw. Now, you're asking yourself, wait a minute, you were a renter. Why do you need a chainsaw? Right? Guys, you know why you need a chainsaw. Just because someday someone might knock on your door and say, hey, do you have a chainsaw? And if you say no, that's shameful. So, 3 or 4 years earlier, I bought a chainsaw. I had not had any opportunity to use it. Now, I'm a homeowner. I got these trees, about half a dozen of them that need to be dispatched, and I got a chainsaw. I could not run to my garage fast enough, pull that chainsaw out of its case, fire it up, and walk around the yard. And I quickly, within 10 minutes, dispatched of these trees. 6, 7 of them. Biggest one being that cedar tree. The whole family's out watching the spectacle. I got 2 young boys. They're loving it, because what kid doesn't love loud noises, power tools, and falling trees, right? When I'm done with all the trees, shut off the chainsaw, and I look around the yard, and I can't find my oldest daughter. She's 8 years old at this time. And I'm wondering where she was. The whole family's out in the yard, and I start walking around the yard, and I find her at the base of the largest tree in our yard. It's a cottonwood tree. It's about 70 feet tall. One large trunk comes out, splits into 3 giant trunks. It's essentially 3 trees in one. And my daughter's at the base of this tree with her arms wrapped as far around as she can reach. She can't even go maybe 15% around the tree. That's how large this is. Tears are streaming down her eyes. She says, not this one. Don't touch this one. She's begging me. I knew this tree. When we moved into our house the first day where it was warm enough to actually spend some time outside, I looked out my kitchen window and I saw my daughter sitting at the base of this tree. Her back leaned up against it. I could see through the glass in the kitchen window that she was having a conversation. I went out there and I said, hey, sweetie, what What are you doing? Talking to my friend. Where's your friend? She's right here. Her name's Nancy. I said, it's cute that you gave this tree a name. And in all seriousness, she looks at me and she says, I didn't give her the name. Her name is Nancy. That's what she told me. Okay. And on that spring day, there's my daughter, arms around Nancy, crying, begging me, don't touch this one. I explained to her, I said, sweetie, these trees that I had to cut down, they should have never been allowed to grow where they were growing. If we don't take care of them now, they're going to cost us a lot of money, a few years. I said, Nancy's fine. She was still visibly upset and shaken, and I told her, I said, sweetie, in our Mohican ways, in our culture, we have a ceremony that we perform whenever we cut down trees or take plants or hunt an animal. I said, I'd like for you to follow me along and participate as we do this. And so I went in and I got my medicine pouch and grabbed some handfuls of ceremonial tobacco. Now, you can't think of tobacco the way you think of tobacco today. Tobacco is a long-standing tradition of how we as natives approach creation. And any time we harvest a plant or cut a tree or take an animal in a hunt, we offer a thank offering of tobacco for the spirit of what we have taken. And we went around to all of the trees that I had taken down just 10 minutes earlier, and we laid our tobacco on the stumps of those trees, and we apologized. We asked forgiveness. We said a prayer. And we finally get to the cedar tree, the largest of the trees that I had to take down that day. And I lay my tobacco on the stump of this cedar tree, and I apologize, and I offer a prayer. And my daughter, standing next to me, she follows suit. She lays her tobacco down. Her little 8-year-old hands placing tobacco so tenderly on this stump. And then she leans down to speak to the stump. And she says, just so you know, it was him. Anyone have kids like that? Let's be in prayer for each other. Okay? If we're going to speak about creation care, it only makes sense to go back to the story of creation. Now, if you ask the average Christian, tell me your story of creation, they're going to go to Genesis chapter 1. It's the story we're all familiar with, and it makes sense. If you're going to start a story, start on the first page, right? And we all know Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and formless, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters of the deep. And then God spoke, let there be light. And there was light. And God speaks the stages of creation into existence from there. And it's a beautiful story. It's a powerful story. It is intended to be a powerful story. But I'm going to submit to you, it's not our creation story. As if we know anything about the history of this narrative, this story, Genesis chapter 1, this is a story that comes out of Babylonian oppression and captivity. And when you read Genesis chapter 1 in concert with the Babylonian understanding of the deities, then what emerges in Genesis chapter 1 is clearly a reaction to the Babylonian pantheon of deities, those of their oppressors. It's a story that reads very much like, okay, Babylonian captors, you have your gods, which are symbolized by various animals and different things that crawl on the earth or walk on the surface of it. Guess what? Our God just spoke a word, and all of those animals came into existence. Genesis chapter 1 is a story that says, okay, Babylonian captors, one of your main gods is the God of the sun, who rides across the sky in a flaming chariot. Guess what? Our God? Yeah. Our God, He's so powerful that He made light 2 days before He made the sun. Take that, Babylon. Genesis chapter 1 is very much a theological spitting match. You know what a spitting contest is? For the dignified ladies, I'll let you in on a secret. A spitting contest is when young elementary school kids go out on the playground and they line up in a straight line and they have a contest to see who can spit the farthest. And whoever spits the farthest wins. Okay? It is the epitome of juvenile masculinity to be able to spit farther than any of your classmates. I don't know why. That's just the way we're created. We're sorry. Genesis chapter 1 is saying, guess what, Babylon? Our God can spit farther than any of your gods. So Genesis chapter 1 is a powerful story. But in terms of our creation story, I don't think that's it. You see, if we simply turn the page and we now look at Genesis chapter 2, then I think we're getting into our actual creation story. Many people don't realize, but Genesis chapter 2 is actually much older than Genesis chapter 1. Some historians say that it's a full 1,000 years older than Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2, I'm going to submit to you, is the indigenous story of creation. Because in Genesis chapter 2, we have a very personal, relational God who literally bends down and gets their creative hands dirty in the process of creation. If you think about it, in Genesis chapter 2, the Creator literally reaches down to the body of the earth and pulls life from her body. I have 4 kids. My youngest is 5 years old. He'll be 6 at the end of May. On our 4th child, we're figuring we're kind of experts, right? We don't need the doctors. We don't need the, hospital and all that. And so we gave birth just with a midwife in a birth center. And this midwife, Rachel, she was incredible, phenomenal, very capable, very calm, cool, on top of everything. But then she did one thing that caused me to question why we ever chose Rachel in the first place. Because at the critical moment, parents, you know what I mean when I say at the critical moment? At the critical moment, Rachel steps aside. She looks at me, says, "Dad, get in there." And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? "Dad, get in there. Catch your baby." What could I do? I reached down to the body of my wife. With these hands, I literally pulled life out of the body of my wife. In Genesis chapter 2, the Creator reaches down to the body of the earth and literally pulls life out of the earth's body. Now, a careful reading of Genesis chapter 2 reveals some details that are perhaps a little confusing if we don't put them in context. Because after the body of humanity is literally pulled out of the earth mother, Scripture then says that the Creator leans down and breathes into the nostrils the breath of life. Anyone ever noticed that in reading Genesis chapter 2 before? Breathes into the nostrils. Why the nostrils? It's actually kind of gross if you think about nostrils. No one regularly wants to think about nostrils. And now everyone in the room is actually thinking about their nostrils. And you're like, move along, preacher, this is kind of gross. Nostrils. Why nostrils? To introduce oxygen, life-giving breath into a body. Now you and I know, everyone in this room knows, that let's say Pastor Dan all of a sudden flops over, he's unconscious on the floor, and he's not breathing. Okay? Now, we are going to rush into action, and because you're good Methodists, you're going to hold a business meeting to have a congregational vote to decide if we want to revive him. Right? Once you have the vote, you're going to move into action to revive him, and you know, and I know, and everyone in this room knows, and we've known for our entire lives, that if we have to breathe oxygen into his lifeless body, the quickest way to do that is mouth to mouth. But that's not what the Creator did. The story doesn't say he breathed into the mouth the breath of life. It says he breathed into the nostrils. Why nostrils? You see, in the process of birth, when babies are in the womb, there's a protective mechanism that their little bodies create called nasal plugs. Little bits of mucus that are impacted into the nostrils of the baby. It's a protection mechanism. Prevents from any kind of infection in anything that might be in the amniotic fluid coming into the body of the baby. About 90% of the time, when the baby passes through the birth canal, it squeezes the nostrils in such a way that those plugs, you never even see them. But every once in a while, a baby is born with the nasal plugs still in the nostrils. Nowadays, when that happens, we have very official-looking, sterilized rubber suctioning instruments, and we just clear that nasal passage. But you know what they did before we had sterilized rubber suctioning instruments? When a baby was born, with the nasal plug still in, the midwife would bend down, place her mouth over the nostrils of the baby, and suck them out and spit them to the side. Literally breathing into the nostrils the breath of life. Genesis 2, our indigenous creation story. It's not a reaction to any kind of oppression. It's not a reaction to any other deities. It is literally a birth story in which humanity is lovingly pulled from the body of the divine feminine. The mother. And the breath of life is breathed into the nostrils. Two years ago, my wife and I, we noticed that Nancy was sick. A crack had opened up in one of her 3 massive trunks. we brought an arborist out, and he did an assessment and told us that Nancy was actually endangering our property and our family because one of her trunks was completely hollow, and all it would take is a good windstorm, and 70 feet of tree would come down, possibly injuring anyone in its path. We made the hard decision that Nancy had to be taken down. My daughter, she was 10 at the time, was devastated. She grieved that loss. She cried for days. The tree company we utilized wasn't very professional, and they left the trunk, about 4 or 5 feet of the trunk, and they said, yeah, we're going to come back with some other equipment and take care of that. About 7, 8, 10 days go by, and the trunk is still there, and I have to call the tree company because my daughter, in seeing this trunk, she's reliving this trauma of losing her best friend over and over. Every day after school, she would go and sit and lean against Nancy's trunk and cry. Finally, I got a hold of the tree company, and I said, I'm going to take down this trunk. If you're here, you'll get paid. If you're not here, you're not getting paid. So I suggest you be here. We took the trunk down, and as it fell, part of it split open and revealed the rotted, hollow area inside. And in there, have you ever been in a situation where you see something that's like a normal, everyday object, but it's totally out of context, and so your mind can't figure it out? So when this trunk opens up, inside, I see something, and at first I'm kind of grossed out because it looked like raw meat in here. And my first reaction was, okay, clearly some predator animal found a little hidey hole and is storing food in my tree. But then I looked, and I'm like, okay, this section of the tree, it's closed at the top. It's closed at the bottom. There's no way that any animal could access this and get in here. And then I looked closer and realized that it was a rock. It was a large rock inside this tree. And it was a deep red, like raw meat. And it had little white veining in it, like raw meat. And in the moisture of this rotted wood, it was wet. It looked like a heart. Not a cute little elementary school heart, but like an actual organ. It looked like a heart. I held it in my hand. It's about 2/3 the size of my fist. In other words, it was the size of a 10-year-old's heart. The only way for this rock to be in this tree was that 100 years ago, when Nancy was starting her life, she encountered an obstacle. Now, trees are incredibly smart. When they encounter an obstacle, they can simply grow around it. But Nancy made a different decision 100 years ago. When hitting this obstacle, this rock, she didn't go around it. She took it inside her body and held it. And I called my daughter down. I told her, I said, look what Nancy was holding for you. The only reason for this rock, this heart, to to be here is because 100 years ago when Nancy started her life, she knew that she would fall in love with a little girl, but she wouldn't be able to stay very long. And she reached out and she found a gift, a treasure that she would hold for 100 years. So that when the time came for her to say goodbye, she could give you something that you would remember her by for the rest of your life. Nancy gave you her heart. The Crying Indian taught us the earth is our most valuable resource. It's incumbent upon us to protect it. The ancients, in navigating their spiritual world, rightfully asked the question, if God is our Father, where is our mother? The correction I would have for that commercial is not that the earth is our most valuable resource and it's incumbent upon us to protect it. I would offer a slight change in vocabulary. The earth is our most valuable relative, and it's incumbent upon us to protect her. If God is our Father, where is our mother? We walk upon her. And every day she gives us the most beautiful gifts imaginable. Please, please walk gently. Thank you.